The day I buried my wife, I thought the worst pain of my life was already behind me. I was wrong. Because grief doesn't always come from loss. Sometimes it comes from the people who smile at you during the funeral and start planning against you before the flowers even die. I never imagined that the same family who hugged me that morning would divide my house behind my back that very night. And they all made the same mistake. They forgot one thing about me. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 67 years old. And before you see what happens next in my life, subscribe to this channel. And if you've ever faced betrayal from your own family, leave a comment with your city or country. Because I promise you, you're not alone. I met my wife, Linda, when we were both young and broke. No savings. No family support. Just two people who believed that if they worked hard enough, life would eventually be fair. We built everything together. That house everyone wanted later? That wasn't an inheritance. That was 38 years of early mornings, missed vacations, and second jobs. Linda handled the warmth of the home. I handled the weight of keeping it standing. And for decades we did just fine. Her family was always around. Not close. Just around. They showed up for holidays. Borrowed money sometimes. Smiled when things were good. Disappeared when things were hard. I didn't complain. Linda loved them, and that was enough for me. Then she got sick. It didn't happen overnight. At first, it was small things, fatigue, forgotten words, short breaths. Doctor's visits turned into hospital stays. Hope turned into quiet prayers. During those months, something else happened too. Her family started visiting more. At first, I thought it was love, support, concern. But looking back now, I see it clearly. They weren't coming for Linda. They were coming for the house. They asked strange questions. Is everything paid off? Did you ever think of updating paperwork? This area is worth a lot now, you know. I brushed it off. I was tired. I was scared. And I trusted people I shouldn't have. When Linda passed away, my world went silent. The house felt too big. Too empty. Every corner reminded me of her voice, her laugh, her way of folding laundry just slightly wrong. The funeral was crowded. Too crowded. People I hadn't seen in years suddenly cared deeply about my well-being. Hands on my shoulder. Soft voices. Fake concern. Her brother, Mark, stood closest to me that day. Don't worry, Robert, he said. We're family. We'll take care of everything. I didn't know then that those words weren't comfort. They were a warning. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the living room. Linda's photo still on the table. The smell of flowers already turning stale. I cried harder than I had all week. And while I was breaking down, they were breaking things apart. 3 days after the funeral, Mark came over again. This time, he didn't bring sympathy. He brought paperwork. He sat across from me like he owned the place. Like I was just a guest in my own home. Robert, he said, clearing his throat. We've been talking as a family. That sentence changed everything. He explained it calmly. Too calmly. Linda would have wanted the house shared fairly. You're getting older. It's a big responsibility for one man. Then he said the words that still ring in my ears. We think it's best if we divide things now, before it gets complicated. Divide things. My house. My life. My memories. I stared at him, waiting for the joke. None came. That's when I noticed something. He wasn't asking. He was informing me. I told him no. Simple. Clear. Final. His expression changed immediately. The warmth disappeared. The patience vanished. Well, he said, standing up. You might not have much of a choice. That night I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me woke up. The next week was hell. Relatives I barely spoke to started calling. Suggesting. Pressuring. Warning. They spoke as if Linda's death had erased me too. As if I had become temporary. One afternoon, I came home from the grocery store and noticed something odd. The spare bedroom door was open. Inside, boxes were stacked neatly. My old tools. My winter clothes. Moved. Organized. Like someone had already started preparing for my exit. I stood there for a long time, holding a bag of groceries, realizing one brutal truth. They weren't waiting for permission anymore. They were counting on my grief to keep me quiet. That night, I walked through every room of the house. I touched the walls. The door frames. The kitchen table Linda and I bought secondhand when we had nothing. And I made a decision. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't fight loudly. I would let them believe exactly what they wanted. That I was tired. That I was alone. That I was weak. Because people like them make the same mistake every time. They confuse silence with surrender. And they forget something very important. Before I was a grieving husband. Before I was an old man. I was the one who built everything they were trying to take. And I remembered something else too. Something none of them bothered to check. Something that changed everything. But they wouldn't realize that. Not yet. Silence can be powerful. When I stopped arguing, they thought they had won. That was their first mistake. For the next few days, I stayed quiet. No angry calls. No confrontations. No emotional breakdowns in front of them. I cooked simple meals. Cleaned the house. Sat on the porch in the evenings, staring at nothing in particular. From the outside, I probably looked like a man who had given up. Inside, I was watching everything. Mark started showing up more often. Not alone. He brought others with him, cousins, aunts, people who suddenly felt entitled to an opinion about my life. They didn't come together. They came in turns. That wasn't accidental. One would come in the morning, full of fake kindness. "We're worried about you, Robert. You shouldn't be alone like this." Another would come in the afternoon, pretending to be practical. "You know how expensive maintenance is. This house could be too much for you." Then, in the evening, someone would call with concern masked as advice. "Don't make things harder than they need to be." Different voices. Same message. Give up control. What they didn't realize was how familiar this pattern was to me. I'd seen it before. Years ago, at work, when younger managers tried to push older men out quietly. Pressure them until they felt useless. I survived that. And I wasn't about to lose my home to the same trick. One afternoon, Mark brought documents again. Not official looking. Just papers printed at home. He placed them on the dining table, right where Linda used to serve dinner. That felt intentional. "This just makes things easier," he said, tapping the pages. "No drama. No fights." I looked at the papers. They were written carefully. Vaguely. Too vaguely. No clear boundaries. No clear ownership. Just promises and assumptions. That's how people steal without touching anything. I slid the papers back toward him. "I'm not signing anything," I said calmly. He smiled. Not warmly. Patiently. "That's okay," he replied. "We'll come back to it." The way he said it told me everything. This wasn't over. That evening, something small happened that told me how far they were willing to go. I opened the mailbox. Inside were letters addressed to people who didn't live there. Mark. His sister. Even a nephew. Same address. My address. They were slowly planting themselves into my home. Creating proof of presence. Creating confusion. Creating leverage. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I did something else. I started remembering. I remembered the long nights Linda and I spent budgeting at the kitchen table. The arguments about whether we could afford repairs. The signatures. The decisions. I remembered how careful Linda always was. She always said, I whispered to myself one night, "Never leave loose ends." That thought stayed with me. The next morning, I went into the storage room. Most people see storage as clutter. I saw history. Boxes stacked high, untouched for years. I opened them one by one. Old tax files, insurance documents, utility records. And then, near the bottom of one box, I found it. A folder Linda labeled in her handwriting. Important. I sat down on the floor, my heart pounding harder than it had in weeks. Inside were copies. Not originals, copies. But clear. Organized. Intentional. Linda had been more aware than I realized. As I read through them, I understood something. She knew. She knew her family well enough to prepare. And she trusted me to figure it out when the time came. That night, Mark called again. His tone had changed. Less friendly. More direct. "We should talk seriously," he said. "Some people are getting impatient." People. That word again. "I'm not going anywhere," I replied. There was a pause on the line. Then he said something revealing. "You don't want things to get ugly, Robert." I smiled to myself. Ugly wasn't what scared me. Being erased did. The next day, I noticed something else. The house felt different. Drawers slightly open. Cabinets rearranged. Not messy. Strategic. They weren't stealing yet. They were testing boundaries. Seeing what I'd notice. Seeing what I'd tolerate. That afternoon, one of Linda's cousins showed up unannounced. She walked around the house like she was inspecting it. "You should really think about downsizing," she said casually. "This place could be better used." Better used. Like I was furniture. I nodded. Let her talk. Let her believe. Because while they were busy measuring rooms in their heads, I was measuring time. I started writing things down. Dates. Visits. Conversations. Who said what? Who touched what? Not emotionally. Logically. Quietly. One evening, as I sat alone, I spoke out loud for the first time in days. "Linda," I said softly. "They think I'm finished." I could almost hear her voice. "Then let them." A week passed. Pressure increased. Mark stopped pretending. "We can't wait forever," he said one afternoon. "You need help. We're stepping in." I looked at him directly. "No," I said. He leaned closer. "You don't understand how this works." Oh, but I did. I understood perfectly. People like him believe control comes from numbers. From noise. From intimidation. They never expect patience. They never expect preparation. That night I made my next move. Not a big one. Not dramatic. Just enough to shift the balance. I made a phone call. Not to confront. Not to threaten. To verify. And what I heard on the other end of the line confirmed everything I suspected. They had assumed something. A very big something. And assumptions are dangerous. Especially when you're dealing with a man who has nothing left to lose. And everything to protect. I hung up the phone and sat quietly in the dark. For the first time since Linda passed, I felt steady. Not angry. Not afraid. Focused. They thought this was about property. They thought this was about age. They thought grief had made me weak. But grief had done something else. It had stripped away my need to please anyone. And now, I was ready. Not to fight loudly. Not to beg for what was already mine. But to let them walk straight into the truth. One step at a time. The moment people think you're cornered, they stop hiding who they really are. That's exactly what happened next. Mark didn't call for 2 days after our last conversation. No visits. No pressure. That silence wasn't respect. It was strategy. On the 3rd day, I woke up to voices in the house. Not loud. Careful. I stood still in the hallway, listening. Mark's voice. And another man's, unfamiliar. They were in the living room. Walking around. Talking about the house like I wasn't there. The structure is solid, the other man said. With a few changes, this place could be worth much more. Mark laughed quietly. I stepped forward. The stranger froze when he saw me. Mark didn't. Oh, Mark said casually. This is just a friend. He knows about property. A friend. In my home. Without asking. That was the moment I understood how far they were already going. They weren't planning anymore. They were preparing. I didn't shout. Didn't ask him to leave. I just stood there. Watching. Letting the silence stretch. The stranger shifted uncomfortably. Mark cleared his throat. We're just exploring options, he said. For everyone's benefit. Everyone. That word again. I nodded slowly. Of course, I replied. They left soon after. Too quickly. That afternoon, I noticed something missing. A small wooden box from the shelf in my bedroom. Inside it were letters. Old ones? Linda's handwriting. Nothing valuable to anyone else. But priceless to me. That's when anger finally touched me. Not explosive. Cold. Controlled. They weren't just testing boundaries anymore. They were erasing traces. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same place Linda and I used to plan our future. And I realized something important. They believed I was reacting. But I wasn't. I was waiting. The next few days unfolded exactly as I expected. More relatives started dropping hints. Some subtle. Some blunt. You don't need all this space. You should think about what's fair. Fair. As if fairness begins after someone dies. As if love expires with a funeral. One afternoon, Mark finally confronted me directly. He didn't bring papers this time. He brought confidence. We've decided something, he said, sitting down without invitation. The house needs to be reorganized. Reorganized. He spoke like a manager addressing an employee. We'll handle maintenance, he continued. Visitors. Repairs. Decisions. And me? I asked calmly. He hesitated. You'll stay here, he said. For now. For now. That was the clearest message yet. I was being downgraded in my own life. I looked at him closely. Really looked. And for the first time, I saw fear beneath his confidence. Not fear of me. Fear of time. Because he needed things to move quickly. People who rush usually do so because something isn't fully in their control. That night, I made another quiet move. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't warn anyone. I simply removed something. A small thing. Something they hadn't thought about. And the next morning, chaos followed. Mark showed up furious. Why can't we access the files? He demanded. I raised an eyebrow. What files? The utility accounts. The maintenance records. I shrugged. I manage those. His face tightened. He had assumed access. Just like he had assumed everything else. Over the next few days, small inconveniences began piling up for them. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. Deliveries delayed. Appointments cancelled. Confusion. People started asking questions. And when people ask questions, stories fall apart. I could feel their frustration growing. Pressure makes greedy people careless. One evening, Mark lost his patience. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I looked up from my chair. No, I said quietly. I'm making it accurate. That word stopped him. Accurate. He stared at me, confused. What do you mean? I leaned back. For weeks, I continued. You've all been talking about what belongs to whom. He didn't answer. So I started paying attention, I said. To details. He stood up. You're overthinking this. No. I was finally thinking clearly. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. Because I knew something they didn't. They believed control came from presence, from noise, from numbers. But control actually comes from understanding. And I understood exactly how fragile their plan was. The next day, something unexpected happened. One of Linda's relatives called me privately. Not Mark. Someone quieter. Someone who had been watching, just like me. "I don't like what's happening," she said. "They're moving too fast." I listened. Said very little. She told me things. Things that confirmed my suspicions. Plans discussed without me. Decisions made in advance. Assumptions treated as facts. When the call ended, I didn't feel angry. I felt validated. That evening, Mark arrived again. This time, alone. His tone was different. Less aggressive. Almost careful. "We need to talk," he said. I gestured to the chair. He didn't sit. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," he began. There it was. The shift. When bullies sense resistance, they rebrand. "We just want what Linda would have wanted," he said. I looked at him steadily. "Then you should have listened to her when she was alive," I replied. He flinched. That hit harder than any argument. Because it was true. He left shortly after. No threats. No confidence. Just irritation. That night, I took out Linda's folder again. I read through it slowly. Not emotionally. Strategically. She hadn't left instructions. She had left clarity. She had trusted me to stand when the time came. And now, the time had come. They thought part one of their plan was complete. Pressure. Presence. Control. They didn't realize they had already lost something important. Momentum. Because once doubt enters a group built on greed, it spreads. Quietly. Just like patience. Just like preparation. Just like the kind of strength that doesn't shout. I stood in the living room and looked around. The walls. The memories. The silence. And I smiled. Not because I had won. But because they were about to learn something they should have known from the beginning. This house wasn't just built with money. It was built with intention. And intention lasts longer than manipulation. They were still playing checkers. I had already moved on. And soon, they would feel it. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It cracks first. I could feel it in the way they spoke to me now. Careful. Measured. Like people who suddenly realize the ground under them isn't as solid as they thought. Mark stopped showing up unannounced. That alone told me everything. Instead, I started getting calls. Short ones. Neutral ones. "How are you holding up, Robert?" "Just checking in." Not concern. Damage control. They were recalculating. Because when manipulation stops working, people search for leverage. And they believed they had won. One afternoon, Mark finally asked me to meet him. Not at the house. At a small cafe nearby. Neutral ground. That was another shift. When someone asks you to leave your own territory, it's because they no longer control it. I arrived early. Sat quietly. Watched people come and go. Mark arrived 10 minutes late. Intentional. He wanted to reassert something. But his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't confident. He was cautious. "We need to find a way forward," he said after sitting down. "This tension isn't good for anyone." I nodded. Let him talk. That's when he tried a new approach. Not pressure. Not authority. Guilt. "Linda wouldn't want this kind of division," he said softly. I looked straight at him. "Linda wouldn't want strangers measuring her house 3 days after her funeral." He swallowed. The silence between us stretched. People nearby laughed, talked, lived their lives. Meanwhile, he was losing his grip. "We just want clarity," he said finally. There it was. Clarity is what people ask for when assumptions collapse. "You should have asked for that in the beginning," I replied calmly. He leaned back. Studied me. For the first time, he wasn't looking at an old widower. He was looking at an obstacle. And obstacles make people nervous. After that meeting, the house went quiet. No visits. No calls. No pressure. That silence felt different than before. Not strategic. Fearful. Because something else had started happening. People began disagreeing. I didn't hear it directly. I felt it indirectly. Conflicting messages. Delayed responses. Uncertainty. One evening, a relative I hadn't heard from in weeks knocked on my door. She didn't come inside. Just stood there. "I think things went too far," she said quietly. I said nothing. "They assumed you'd step aside," she continued. "When you didn't." Plans started falling apart. I thanked her for her honesty. She left quickly. Like someone who didn't want to be seen choosing sides. That night, Mark called again. His voice was tight. "We need to talk again." "About what?" I asked. "About settling this," he replied. Settle. That word had changed meaning. Before it meant dividing. Now, it meant retreating without losing face. "I'm not going anywhere," I said calmly. There was a long pause. "You're making this very difficult," he finally said. "No," I replied. "I'm making it very clear." The next day, something interesting happened. They started contradicting each other. One relative told me, "Mark says you're open to compromise." Another told me, "He says you're being unreasonable." That's how you know a group is fracturing. When the story stops being consistent. Pressure exposes weak alliances. And greed has no loyalty. That evening, I walked through the house again. Slowly. Purposefully. I opened drawers they had rearranged. Returned things to their place. Not to reclaim control, but to remind myself. This wasn't a battlefield. It was my home. And I didn't need permission to exist in it. A few days later, Mark showed up again. Unannounced. But this time, he didn't come inside. He stood at the door. That was new. "I think we need to rethink everything," he said. I crossed my arms. "Why?" He hesitated. "Because not everyone agrees anymore." There it was. The truth. Without noise. Without anger. Just reality. When people realize they misjudged someone, they don't apologize. They retreat. Slowly. Awkwardly. Trying to save pride. Over the next week, their presence faded. No one touched anything. No one suggested changes. The boxes in the spare room stayed untouched. The letters stopped arriving. The house began to feel like mine again. But I wasn't careless. Because people who lose quietly often plan loudly later. One evening, I received a message from Mark. "We should talk one last time." I didn't respond immediately. I waited. Then replied with one sentence. "There's nothing left to discuss." That was it. No explanation. No justification. Silence is strongest when it doesn't seek approval. The final moment came unexpectedly. A family gathering. Not for me. But I was invited. That alone told me everything. When I arrived, conversations paused. Eyes followed me. Not hostile. Uncomfortable. Mark avoided me. Others nodded politely. No one challenged me. Because challenges only come when people believe they can win. I sat quietly. Listened. Watched. And realized something profound. They weren't angry anymore. They were embarrassed. They had misread me. Misjudged my patience. Mistook grief for weakness. And that mistake cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. When I left that evening, no one followed. No one argued. No one demanded. The house welcomed me back with silence. The good kind. The kind that belongs to people who no longer feel threatened. I stood in the doorway and took a deep breath. Linda would have smiled. Not because I fought. But because I stood. Because I didn't trade dignity for peace. Because I remembered who I was. They thought the story was ending. They were wrong. It was simply settling into its rightful place. And there was just one final thing left to do. Not to punish. Not to prove. But to ensure that no one ever tried to erase me again. And when that final step was complete, there would be nothing left for them to take. The house felt different now. Not emptier. Not quieter. Stronger. Like a place that had been tested and survived. For the first time since Linda passed, I woke up without that tight feeling in my chest. No anxiety about who might show up. No fear of what might be moved, touched, or claimed. Just morning light through the curtains she picked. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. And I realized something important. This wasn't about winning. It was about ending something. People like Mark don't stop because they feel guilty. They stop because the cost becomes too high. And I had quietly raised that cost. Over the next few weeks, contact faded almost completely. No surprise visits. No family meetings. No concerned messages. When people lose control, they also lose interest. That's the truth no one talks about. One afternoon, I finally did the thing I had been putting off. I went through Linda's things. Not hurried. Not emotional. Just honest. Her clothes. Her books. Her notes. And tucked inside one of her journals, I found a short entry. No date. Just a few lines. If anything happens to me, I trust Robert to stand his ground. He always does, quietly. I sat there for a long time after reading that. Not crying. Just breathing. Because she had seen this version of me long before anyone else had. The version they underestimated. A few days later, Mark called. I almost didn't answer. But I did. His voice was different. Not angry. Not confident. Tired. I just wanted to say, we're stepping back. He said. No one's going to interfere anymore. I waited. There was more. I think things got misunderstood. He added. I smiled slightly. Misunderstood. That's what people say when they don't want to admit they failed. I wish you well, I replied calmly. Nothing more. Nothing less. When the call ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. That chapter was closed. The house slowly returned to its rhythm. I fixed small things Linda always reminded me about. Repainted the porch railing. Planted flowers she loved near the front steps. Neighbors noticed. Not because I told them anything, but because peace has a way of showing itself. One evening, as I watered the garden, a neighbor asked gently, "Everything okay now?" I nodded. "Yes," I said. "It is." And it was true. But the most important change wasn't outside. It was inside me. I no longer felt the need to explain myself. To justify my presence. To prove my worth. Age teaches you something valuable if you let it. That you don't need permission to exist. Weeks turned into months. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through others. Disagreements among them. Awkward silences at gatherings. Nothing dramatic. Just consequences. People who build plans on entitlement rarely stay united when those plans fail. One afternoon, I sat in the living room, surrounded by memories, and thought about everything that had happened. The pressure. The manipulation. The assumption that grief had erased my strength. They never understood one thing. I wasn't holding on to the house because of walls or land. I was holding on to my life. My history. My dignity. And those things don't get divided just because someone decides they should. That night, I stood in front of Linda's photo. "I kept my promise," I said softly. Not to her. To myself. Because survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just refusing to disappear. I started living again. Slowly. Intentionally. Morning walks. Old friends. Quiet dinners. And every now and then, I'd remember the way they looked at me in the beginning. Like I was temporary. Like I would step aside. And I'd smile. Because the strongest lesson life teaches you late is that still standing is the greatest answer of all. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt pushed aside after giving your whole life to others, if someone assumed your silence meant surrender, remember this. You don't have to fight loudly to win. You just have to refuse to leave. And before you see what happens next in my life, subscribe to this channel. If this story felt familiar, leave a comment with your city or country. And share your experience. Because none of us should have to stand alone. Especially after standing strong for everyone else.